The Post Room, OPEC headquarters, Vienna. Hundreds of letters from dozens of countries. OPEC, the Organization of the Petroleum Exporting Countries. Its 13 members review and coordinate their energy policies. To them, OPEC is an expression of unity and a common belief in the future. But to some in the West, OPEC is seen as a threat to the present. By way of the post bag, they express their fear.
Dear OPEC, it's no wonder one of your preferred methods of transportation is the camel. You're always humping someone.
Cheaper crude on no more food.
It's terrible that you take advantage of the US with your inflated oil prices.
Oil, the world's major source of energy, but finite with diminishing reserves. At the same time, OPEC's major source of revenue. The oil business, born about a century ago, now the biggest business in the world. In the early days, Western entrepreneurs wooed the men in robes from the desert for concessions. In true colonial style, rich deposits of crude were won for as little as the oil companies could get away with. To the industrialized nations, America and Europe, oil became everything. It powered industries, ships and planes, and gave birth to the motor car, symbol of Western prosperity. Cleaner than coal, easier to extract, simple to transport, oil was cheap. After the Second World War, cheap oil fueled the economic recovery of the Western world. The consumer society that resulted found new uses for oil. It could be made into plastic, into textiles for clothes, into 1,001 goods to sell and to buy. Nobody thought much about how much it cost or whether there was a lot of it. Oil was squandered as a source of energy. Oil was there to be used. From 1940 to 1977, the world demand for oil grew from 5.5 million barrels a day to nearly 70 million barrels a day. The Western industrialized nations of the United States, Western Europe, and Japan increased their consumption more than tenfold. Demand rose dramatically, but the posted price of marker crude hardly changed. The posted price was a notional price upon which royalty and taxes were based. It was 1.75 US dollars a barrel in the 1950s. For 11 years, from 1960 to 1971, it stayed the same, 1.80 a barrel. But revenue to oil-producing countries was only about 60% of posted price. The lifestyle of the Western industrialized world, prosperous, consumer-minded. Societies in America, Western Europe, and Japan, cushioned by creature comfort. People with high expectations. People distanced from hunger, disease, want. A sophisticated, complex lifestyle that has grown in the oil age. The noble uses of oil to make plastics and fabrics were once just part of total consumption, not thought of as more worthy. Over 70 countries in the world have oil reserves worth commercial production. West. The member countries of OPEC, though only 13 in number, underwrite half of the world's oil supplies. The ministers of the world's major oil producers meet in Vienna. They are members of OPEC, the Organization of the Petroleum Exporting Countries, who between them are responsible for 85% of the free world's trade in oil. OPEC now has 13 member nations: Algeria, Ecuador, Gabon, Indonesia, Iran, Iraq, Kuwait, the Socialist People's Libyan Arab Jamahiriya, Nigeria, Qatar, Saudi Arabia, the United Arab Emirates, and Venezuela. 350 million people of different race, creed, and culture, united by the fact that rich oil deposits lie beneath their relatively poor lands. Founded 20 years ago, it has modern headquarters in Vienna. Computers and spacious conference rooms, all the trappings of a sophisticated, modern organization. "20 years ago, its founding fathers met in different circumstances. The first conference of the oil producers, convened in 1960 in Baghdad, discussed the fears of the oil-producing nations, who had realized the need to protect their countries from oil companies eager for their own profit. The first meeting in Baghdad was attended by Iran, Iraq, Kuwait, Saudi Arabia, and Venezuela. OPEC came into being because the major oil companies in 1959 and 1960 had lowered the price of crude oil. Small independent firms led by Getty and Hunt had forced the price of crude down. In forming OPEC, the producing countries resolved to protect their own national interests, become a new player in the oil game. For 10 years and more, while OPEC found its feet, membership grew. Qatar joined in January 1961. The Arab Republic of Libya joined in 1962, together with Indonesia. Abu Dhabi, later the United Arab Emirates, joined in 1967. Algeria joined in 1971. So did Nigeria. Ecuador joined in 1973. In 1975, Gabon, a former French African colony, became the 13th member. For a decade, OPEC members met and talked. The Western industrialized world thought or heard little of their ideas. The business OPEC had to learn was a complex one, erected by the multinational oil companies for their own benefit. To play the game, you had to become practiced in the rules. Minor advantages in the early years were gained on royalties. OPEC, as an organization, won a small victory on the acceptance of the principle of collective bargaining. The oil companies attempted to divide the organization by playing one against the other. The first turning point for OPEC came in 1968, when Sheikh Yamani of Saudi Arabia drew up the declaratory statement of petroleum policy of member countries. For the first time, OPEC accepted as a group 4 basic principles. First, that OPEC members should strive to replace the multinational oil companies as owners of crude oil, and themselves become managers of their own country's national asset. Second, that the members of OPEC should work towards gradually replacing oil companies as the original marketers of that crude oil reserve. Third, that OPEC, as the owners of oil resources, should determine prices, not the multinational oil companies. Fourth, that the members of OPEC should think of the pricing and supply of oil in terms of their own needs, rather than solely those of the Western industrialized world. The philosophy was revolutionary. Ideas learnt on the capitalist-dominated campuses of Harvard and other Western universities. If the West felt shocked, it was a standpoint that emanated from its own stable. In 1970, Libya was the first to bring the foreign oil companies to task. Taking Occidental as an example, Libya forced the oil company to accept its terms. National oil prices rose. A multinational had been made to bow down. OPEC began urging a unified pricing strategy. In 1971, the oil companies were given an ultimatum to offer acceptable price increases for the crude they exploited in the name of the Western industrialized world. In February 1971, the oil companies were forced to agree. By the Tehran Agreement, OPEC members received minor price adjustments for their oil. In 1971, the new posted price was $2.18 a barrel. The agreement paved the way for OPEC having a say in deciding the price of oil and not the multinational companies. The 1970s were a decade when new names were heard of in the oil business. Sonatrach in Algeria, Pertamina in Indonesia. The producing national companies of OPEC, the National Iranian Oil Company, the Kuwait National Oil Company, the Nigerian National Petroleum Corporation, became more prominent in the world oil business. At a meeting in Geneva in 1972, OPEC countries agreed with the multinationals to a further rise in oil prices and an understanding that oil revenue should be tied to any depreciation in the value of the dollar. In terms of the gradual nationalization of the producing country's assets, Aramco finally agreed to the Saudi Arabian government having a 20% stake. This percentage became the norm for most OPEC members. 1972 was a busy year. OPEC countries became increasingly concerned with the rapidly dwindling purchasing power of their oil revenues. The multinational oil companies offered token increases. The members of OPEC turned them down. The oil companies were intransigent. They underestimated the oil producers' resolve. Had they taken the producers' view more seriously, they might have continued to control the world's oil supply. On the 16th of October, 1973, the Ministerial Committee, meeting in Kuwait, decided to recommend that the posted prices of all crudes be raised 70%. The price of the marker crude would rise from $3.02 to $5.11 a barrel. 2 months later in Tehran, the Ministerial Committee of the 6 Gulf member countries decided to set the marker crude at $11.65 a barrel, a rise in the producing government's take of 300% in 2 months. $7 a barrel was now the average income of the OPEC member countries. The Western industrialized world was shocked. OPEC's decisions were seen as high-handed, unreasonable, verging on blackmail. OPEC had shown it could affect everyone who drove a car, heated a home, fueled a factory. OPEC became a dirty word. There was sensational propaganda.
If they don't lower the gas, we're gonna lower the boom. Quit shipping all that wheat and corn, forget the golden rule. They don't lower the price of crude, we're gonna cut off the food. And in about a week, they'll sing a different tune. Crude oil prices have got so high, it's getting hard to survive. And I'll bet those Middle East countries are having a laugh. 'Cause the way things are going, well, it won't be very long till we're shelling out $1.50 for a gallon of gas. If they don't lower the gas, we're gonna lower the boom.
All the producing countries had done, however, was to lift oil prices more in line with 1973 inflation. Other commodities and manufactured goods had risen dramatically. Oil had become cheaper and cheaper in real terms. OPEC countries argue it is their future they are bartering. Price rises in crude are an attempt to try and keep pace with Western inflation, which the OPEC countries also suffer from when they buy imported goods. The world pays for oil in American dollars. As the buying power of the dollar becomes worth less and less, the producing countries need more of them in order to buy the same quantity of goods, most of which come from the industrialized countries. Between 1955 and 1970, the purchasing power of the dollar fell by 30%. The increases in the cost of oil only partly made up for the losses of real revenue and purchasing power. The West, moreover, is still guilty of marking up its products when they come to be sold to OPEC countries. A tractor in Rio de Janeiro costs less than the same tractor in Riyadh. As Western economies enter recession, OPEC is attempting to protect the purchasing power of the revenue of its member states. But the Western consumer buying petrol for his car should look elsewhere than OPEC to complain about rising prices. Take France, for example. Out of each barrel of oil products sold in France, over 51% goes to the French government in tax. Over 26% goes to the oil companies. The countries of OPEC get less than 22%, out of which they have to pay their costs of producing the crude. In Italy, it's much the same. The Italian government creams off 41%, the oil companies nearly 21%, and OPEC gets the rest. In Britain, the government takes nearly 30% in tax. The oil companies in costs and profit take over 40% of the barrel, and the OPEC producers get less than 31%. OPEC, despite the computers, the graphs and statistics, is not concerned with wealth for wealth's sake. Member countries have much to do with the revenue they get. In the Middle East, there are new schools, hospitals, clinics, homes to build where there were none, electric light to replace the gloom of oil lamps, roads for motorized transport to replace the routes of the camel, mechanized docks to handle large ships instead of having to beach primitive dhows. And in the Middle East, a need to train the people for industries where there were none, petrochemical plants, cement works, ship repair yards, and factories. The spacious cities of the Gulf states are deceptive. They have the prosperous air of any downtown area of modern America. But beyond, there is the vast desert, where the problems of the future for the people still have to be resolved, if they are not to be condemned to return to the old way of existence when the wells run dry. Oil revenues still have much to do if the concrete and glass cities are not to become sand-swept ghost towns, monuments to remind the world of an opportunity that was lost or denied the people of the Middle East by the West's own selfish determination to continue to prosper. Indonesia, the largest member of OPEC, with over 140 million people. Once part of the old Dutch Empire, Indonesia has a long and rich history. But it is a new state, barely 30 years old, with all the problems of a developing nation of the Third World. Indonesia is the biggest producer of petroleum in the Far East. By a series of 5-year plans, in large part financed by oil revenue, positive development is taking place in fields of pharmaceuticals, chemicals, the electrical industry, and mechanical engineering. The Indonesian people share the dilemma of all OPEC nations. Most of her oil fields now in production have only a relatively short lifetime remaining, and the need is to develop non-oil exports to improve the production of her other resources. Nigeria, a West African republic. Until it became independent in 1960, Nigeria was Britain's largest colony. The country is rich in minerals, manganese ore, silver and monazite. But oil is Nigeria's chief export, enabling her population of nearly 80 million to improve their standard of living. Nigeria has an inadequate infrastructure. She needs schools, hospitals, roads, houses, like many developing countries. And she needs skilled labor to make industrial development practical. Her prosperity now has to be turned into wealth for the future. Venezuela, the larger member of the two South American countries of OPEC. Like Indonesia and Nigeria, Venezuela was once a colony of a European power. To Venezuela's 13 million people, oil is everything. A major producer since the 1920s, Venezuela has to rely upon money she can get for her crude to survive. Until recently, most of her crude oil was refined in the Netherlands East Indies, but she now increasingly does for herself what she once paid others to do. Oil revenue is building refineries. For Venezuela, there is also a pressing need to diversify her economy, find new products to pay for food, to house and educate her people. Venezuela is building the vast Guri Dam, one of the largest in the world, which will help her develop her rich iron ore deposits. Venezuela began an ambitious 5-year development plan in 1976, aimed at building up aluminium and steel industries. She is also using oil revenues to expand her transport and communication systems. Men of South America share the problems of Arabs, Iranians, Africans, and people from the Far East. What to do to make secure a future for their children? What to do when the oil has gone and there is little in their nation worth anything to the world? In OPEC, they have a forum, a place to talk, a place to learn from each other's experiences in the difficult, often disappointing business of developing. In OPEC, they have an organization that gives them unified strength in the face of the powerful Western industrialized world, organized, astute, subtle in its pressure. In March 1975, the sovereigns and heads of state of OPEC member countries met in Algiers. A solemn declaration was adopted by the summit conference in which OPEC stressed that increased oil prices had not significantly led to world inflation, that any threat to their sovereignty would be resisted, and that cooperation, not confrontation, was necessary to solve world economic problems. The summit called for an international conference held later that year to discuss the problems of developed and developing nations. 7 OPEC members were among the 19 developing countries that attended. An OPEC special fund was set up in January 1976 at a ceremony in Paris. $800 million were immediately committed. By 1980, the fund, with its headquarters also in Vienna, had committed well over $1 billion to help bridge the social and economic gap between the haves and the have-nots, the developed and the developing. More than $3 billion are still available at this moment for aid, as some OPEC members would like to see the Western world match in terms of their own gross national product. OPEC countries give 3% of their GNP in overseas aid. The world as a whole, less than 1%. Many countries within OPEC are producing beyond their economic needs in order to supply the West, keep her industrialized economies going. In so doing, they are diminishing the length of time of their own economic futures. Theirs is a catch-22. They cannot allow Western economies to plunge into recession, currencies to become worthless paper money, for their oil exports are paid for in those currencies. So are their imports. They would be first and worst hit. The lives of producing and consuming nations are intrinsically bound together. Neither can afford to live for today at the expense of tomorrow. Until technology develops alternative sources of energy, solar, nuclear, or whatever, neither side of the equation can afford the risk of leaving future generations with nothing. OPEC finds it hard to understand why some people think that they are a greedy, money-grabbing cartel extracting a ransom from the West. At OPEC, they have a reply to those who do not understand why some things seem to cost more than they used to.